The order of expulsion was delivered on May 1st, 1889. It was a document of stark finality, penned in the severe, angular script of Elder Theron, the chairman of the Havenwood Town Council. It declared that Alara Vance, widow of the late Jacob Vance, was to be dispossessed of her marital home and the adjoining 3 acres of land. The reason, stated with a chilling lack of sentiment, was that a lone woman of 19 years, without husband or father to provide for her, constituted an untenable burden upon the community's resources. The property, the document concluded, would be absorbed into the town's collective holdings, to be allocated to a more productive family unit. She was given 7 days to vacate the premises and remove herself beyond the township's established boundaries. She stood before the 3 men of the council in the austere, timber-framed meeting hall, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. Elder Theron, a man whose piety was exceeded only by his rigid adherence to pragmatism, regarded her with an expression of detached pity. To his right sat Silas, the blacksmith, a man of immense physical strength whose opinions were forged with the same brute force as his ironwork. On his left, Deacon Miller, a merchant whose ledgers were his true scripture, fidgeted with a silver watch chain, his gaze fixed on the floorboards as if calculating the precise financial liability Alara represented. There was no recourse, no appeal. The decision was absolute, a social and economic amputation performed for the perceived health of the body politic. Her husband, Jacob, had been dead for 6 months, his life claimed by a falling widowmaker while felling timber in the high country. He had been a man respected for his strength and skill, a vital part of the small, isolated community nestled in the Cinder Creek Valley. With his death, Alara's status had plummeted from the wife of a valued citizen to a piece of unclaimed human property. She had no male relatives in Havenwood to speak for her, to absorb her into their household. She was an anomaly, and Havenwood's council did not tolerate anomalies. She was 19 years old. The only person who did not treat her as a ghost was her grandmother, Maeve, who lived in a small cottage at the town's edge, too frail and old to contest the council's decree but possessed of a different kind of power. That evening, as Alara packed her few belongings, Jacob's tools, a cast-iron skillet, 2 woolen blankets, and a small collection of books, Maeve arrived. She did not weep or rage against the injustice. Instead, she pressed a small heavy leather pouch into Alara's hand. Inside were $47 in silver coins, Maeve's life savings. "It is not much," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves, "but it is a beginning." Then she added, her eyes holding a flicker of ancient light, "Remember the stories of the old people, my girl. Remember the veil. The water gives, and the water takes, but it always provides a sanctuary for those who know how to listen." The Vale, or Vale Falls as it was formerly known, was a local landmark a mile upstream from Havenwood. It was a place of superstitious awe, where the Cinder Creek plunged 80 feet over a granite escarpment. The falls were considered dangerous, the currents treacherous, and the surrounding cliffs unstable. No one built near it. Children were warned away from it. But Alara remembered her grandmother's stories, tales passed down from ancestors who had lived in the valley long before men like Elder Theron had arrived with their laws and ledgers. They were stories of people who did not fight the valley's formidable nature but lived within its folds, finding shelter in the unlikeliest of places. A plan, audacious and born of pure desperation, began to form in her mind. It was a plan that centered on the one place no one in Havenwood would ever think to look for a home, directly behind the thundering curtain of the Vale itself. On the 3rd day of May, Alara made her final transactions in Havenwood. She approached Silas at his forge, the heat of the furnace a stark contrast to the coldness in his eyes. She required materials, not as a supplicant, but as a paying customer. "I need 20 iron pitons, sharpened to a 3-inch point, and a good felling axe," she stated, her voice even. Silas grunted, his massive arms crossed over his leather apron. "Building a life in the wilderness, are you? A fool's errand for a girl alone. The wolves will have you before the first snow." Yet he could not refuse a cash transaction. He sold her the pitons for $3 and the axe, a fine piece of tempered steel with a hickory handle, for another 4. The exchange was grim, a business deal steeped in his unconcealed certainty of her failure. Her next stop was Deacon Miller's Mercantile. The store was a cluttered emporium of essentials and trifles, smelling of cured tobacco, coffee beans, and bolt cloth. The deacon, seeing her enter, adopted a posture of strained magnanimity. "My dear child," he began, his tone unctuous, The council's decision was a heavy one, but necessary for the good of all. Alara cut him off, her patience worn thin. I need a 50-pound sack of flour, 20 pounds of salt pork, 10 pounds of beans, a keg of nails, and 200 feet of good hemp rope. She laid her list on the counter, along with a stack of silver coins. The total came to $17.50. As he weighed out the goods, he offered unsolicited advice. You should take this money and buy a coach ticket to the city. There's no future for you in these mountains. This is a hard land, a man's land. Alara simply gathered her purchases, a burlap sack slung over each shoulder, and walked out without another word. The remaining $22.50 she kept secured in the leather pouch, a final reserve against the unknown. Her final confrontation came on the 5th day, as she was making her last trip from her former home, hauling a handcart laden with her supplies towards the path that led upstream. Elder Theron intercepted her at the edge of town, his face a mask of stern disapproval. I had hoped you would have the sense to leave the valley entirely, he said, his voice carrying the weight of patriarchal authority. What is your intention, girl? To squat on township land just beyond our sight? Alara stopped and looked him directly in the eye, her small frame unbowed. I intend to build a shelter, she replied, her voice clear and steady. Where? He demanded. Behind the veil, she said. A flicker of disbelief, followed by a dry, humorless chuckle, crossed Theron's face. Behind the waterfall? That is madness. It is a wet, dark, and treacherous place. The first spring freshet will scour that alcove clean. You will be washed away with the river stones. His certainty was absolute, grounded in generations of conventional wisdom that saw the falls as nothing more than a dangerous, chaotic force of nature. You are choosing your own tomb. It is a sin of pride, to so flagrantly disregard the counsel of your elders and the clear dangers that God has placed before us. Not one of them had ever considered the geology of the place. Not one had ever studied the high water marks from previous floods. And not one would entertain the notion that a 19-year-old girl armed with ancestral stories might understand the valley's hydrology better than they did. Alara simply adjusted the ropes on her handcart. I will take my chances with the river, she said quietly. It feels more honest than the charity of men who would see me starve. She pushed the cart past him, leaving him standing in the dusty road, a pillar of righteous, unbending conviction. His final words followed her up the path. So be it. We will not be responsible for retrieving your body. The dramatic irony was a currency he could not yet comprehend. He was pronouncing judgment from a foundation of solid, predictable earth, never imagining that the earth itself was about to become the most unpredictable thing of all. The work began on May 8, 1889. The alcove behind Vale Falls was a space of primordial grandeur and profound acoustic power. It was a vast, crescent-shaped cavern, carved from the granite escarpment over millennia by the relentless force of the Cinder Creek. The space measured roughly 40 feet along its curved back wall and extended outward to a depth of 22 feet at its center. The ceiling soared to a height of nearly 50 feet before disappearing into shadow. The air was perpetually cool and filled with a fine, atomized mist from the cascading water, which formed a translucent, ever-shifting wall just beyond the cavern's edge. The sound was the most overwhelming feature, a constant, deep-throated roar that was not merely heard but felt, a vibration that resonated in the bones and seemed to shake the very stone of the mountain. It was a sound that would have driven most people to madness, but for Alara, it was the sound of solitude, a protective barrier of white noise that walled her off from the world that had rejected her. Her first task, taught to her through Maeve's careful instruction, was to manage the water. While the main cascade fell clear of the alcove's floor, the rock walls themselves wept with moisture, and the perpetual mist ensured the ground was a slick, treacherous surface of mud and loose stone. Her survival depended on creating a dry, stable living space. She began not with a hammer or an axe, but with a simple spade and a mattock. For 3 weeks she labored, digging a series of carefully graded drainage channels. She started at the highest point at the rear of the cavern, carving a primary channel, 6 inches wide and 8 inches deep, that followed the curve of the back wall. From this, she dug a series of radiating secondary channels, like the veins of a leaf, all sloped with meticulous precision towards the front of the alcove. The work was grueling. The ground was a dense composite of clay and rock, and each foot of progress was a battle. She used a spirit level Jacob had owned, ensuring a consistent 1-degree downward slope, a minute gradient that was nonetheless sufficient to coax the seeping water away from her intended building site and harmlessly back toward the river's edge. This was the first principle of her grandmother's teaching. Do not block the water, guide it. With the drainage system complete, she addressed the foundation. A conventional wooden floor would rot in months in the damp air. She needed a foundation of stone, one that would create a solid, dry platform raised above the damp earth. Over the next month, she hauled hundreds of flat, water-smoothed stones from the creek bed downstream, a perilous task that involved wading into the swift current and carrying the heavy stones, some weighing over 50 pounds, back to her site. She selected each one for its shape and thickness, slowly amassing a formidable pile. Then she began the painstaking process of laying the floor. She started in the center of the driest area, a space measuring 12 feet wide by 16 feet deep. She laid the largest, flattest stones first, fitting them together like pieces of a complex puzzle. Using a mixture of sand and clay dug from a deposit she found further up the cliff face, she created a crude but effective mortar, packing it into the gaps. Each stone was tamped down and checked with the spirit level, creating a floor that was not only solid but perfectly flat. The finished platform was raised a full foot above the surrounding cavern floor, an island of stability in a world of mist and motion. The cost was nothing more than her own sweat and the caloric energy from her dwindling supply of salt pork and beans. Only then did she turn her attention to the structure itself. In the dense woods on the plateau above the falls, she selected her timber. She chose cedar, not for its strength, but for its legendary resistance to rot and insects, a lesson learned from watching Jacob work. Felling the trees with the new axe was a formidable challenge for a woman of her size, but she was methodical. She used wedges and her knowledge of grain and balance, bringing down 10 mature cedars over the course of a week. The most difficult part was transporting the logs. She could not haul them whole. Instead, she spent another 2 weeks on the plateau, bucking the logs into manageable 12 and 16-foot lengths, then hewing them flat on 2 sides with a broad axe, transforming round logs into squared beams. Her hands, once soft, were now a landscape of calluses and blisters. To get the heavy beams down to the alcove, she employed the 200-foot hemp rope. Anchoring one end to a massive old-growth oak, she would carefully lower each beam down the rock face, a slow, controlled descent that took hours for each piece of timber. The cabin she designed was an A-frame, a simple but incredibly strong structure ideal for her needs. Its steep sloping roof would shed any moisture that blew in from the falls, and its simple construction required fewer complex joints than a traditional cabin. She erected the main triangular frames first, joining the heavy cedar beams at the peak, and securing them with mortise and tenon joints she painstakingly carved with a chisel and mallet. Each joint was a testament to her patience, fitted so precisely that they held together even before being pegged. To secure the structure against the powerful drafts that swirled behind the falls, she anchored the base of the A-frames directly to the granite wall of the cavern itself. This was the purpose of the iron pythons. Using a heavy sledgehammer, she drove the sharpened iron spikes deep into fissures in the rock, 2 for each of the 4 main frames. She then lashed the base of the cedar beams to these immovable anchors with her hemp rope, creating a structure that was essentially fused to the mountain. Silas had mocked her purchase, but his ironwork now formed the critical link between her ingenuity and the bedrock of the valley. The walls and roof were one and the same. She split cedar logs into rough planks, or shakes, and layered them over the A-frame skeleton, overlapping each one to create a watertight skin. The final, crucial step was sealing it all. Maeve had taught her the recipe for an ancient, effective sealant. She gathered pine resin from the trees on the plateau, a sticky, laborious process. In an old pot, she heated the resin over a fire, mixing it with fine clay and a measure of charcoal powder. The resulting substance was a thick, black, waterproof pitch. For days, she meticulously applied this pitch to every seam, every joint, every nailhead on her structure, rendering her small cabin impervious to the constant, penetrating mist. The cabin, dark and smelling of cedar and pine tar, was now a sanctuary, a dry and secure pod nestled within the damp, roaring heart of the falls. The final element of her survival was fire. A hearth was essential for warmth, cooking, and drying her clothes. Building a fireplace inside a wooden structure located in a damp, drafty cave was a dangerous proposition. She constructed the hearth and chimney entirely from stone, using the same river rocks and clay mortar as she had for the floor. She built it against the cavern's back wall, allowing the massive granite escarpment to act as a thermal mass, absorbing and radiating heat back into the cabin long after the fire had died down. The most ingenious part was the flue. She had noticed a narrow, vertical fissure in the rock face that extended upwards into the darkness. By carefully channeling the stone chimney to meet this natural vent, she was able to direct the smoke up and away, out through the top of the cliff. It was a perfect, pre-existing solution that a conventional builder would never have found or dared to use. The first fire she lit in the hearth did not just bring physical warmth. It was a profound symbol of her victory. The smoke drew perfectly, and the small cabin filled with a steady, life-giving heat. The cost of her home, excluding the initial $27 in materials, had been 3 months of relentless, solitary labor. Summer bled into early autumn. The relentless work of building gave way to the steady rhythm of survival. Alara established a routine dictated by the sun and seasons. Mornings were for foraging on the high plateau, gathering late-season berries, mushrooms, and edible roots. She set snares for rabbits and squirrels, her diet lean but sufficient. Afternoons were spent tending her small home, chopping firewood, and preserving her foraged goods for the winter ahead. She became acutely attuned to the natural world around her. She learned the subtle shifts in the roar of the waterfall, a language that told her of rainfall far up in the mountains. She observed the behavior of the animals, the frantic acorn gathering of the squirrels, the early southward flight of the geese. All the signs pointed to a coming season of unusual severity, a wet and volatile autumn. In late September, the rains began. They were not the gentle showers of a typical autumn, but persistent, heavy downpours that turned the forest floor into a sodden sponge. The Cinder Creek, normally a clear, placid stream in the fall, began to run high and muddy, its voice changing from a murmur to a low growl. In Havenwood, the townspeople noted the weather with mild complaint. They patched their roofs and laid in extra firewood, confident in the structures and systems that had served them for decades. The town was protected by a series of earthen levees along the lower banks of the creek, levees planned and built by Elder Theron's grandfather. They were a point of civic pride, a monument to their forefathers' foresight. "The levees have stood for 50 years, was the common refrain in Deacon Miller's mercantile. They will stand for 50 more. On October 12th, a break in the weather allowed Alara to make a trip into town. Her primary purpose was to check on Maeve. She found her grandmother frail but alert, her small cottage tidy but feeling damp and cold. The air in town felt heavy, saturated with a sense of foreboding that no one else seemed to acknowledge. "The creek is angry," Maeve said, her old eyes looking past Alara toward the window. "The old people knew to move to high ground when the water turned the color of clay." Alara saw it too. The Cinder Creek was no longer just high. It was a thick, roiling slurry of silt and debris, a sign of significant erosion and runoff upstream. "Come with me, grandmother," Alara urged, her voice low and serious. "Come to my shelter. It is dry and safe." Maeve was hesitant, the thought of the difficult journey and the intimidating roar of the falls daunting to her old bones, but she saw the conviction in her granddaughter's eyes, a certainty that went beyond mere opinion. She trusted the bloodline, the ancient wisdom that had been passed down to this determined young woman. "I will pack a small bag," she agreed. As Alara helped her grandmother prepare, Silas the blacksmith passed by the cottage. He saw Alara through the window and stopped, his face clouding with suspicion. He walked on, but Alara knew he would report her presence to the council. Her fears were confirmed as she and Maeve began the slow walk out of town. Elder Theron and Deacon Miller met them on the path. "What is the meaning of this?" Theron demanded, his gaze falling on the small bag in Maeve's hand. "Are you abducting your own grandmother, girl?" Alara stood between the men and Maeve, a small but immovable protector. "I'm taking her to a safer place. A great deal of rain is coming. The creek is too high." Deacon Miller scoffed, a wheezing, incredulous sound. "Spreading fear and panic now, are we? The levees are holding perfectly. You are a fool to be frightened by a bit of autumn rain." Elder Theron's expression was harder. "You are unsettling the populace with your wild superstitions. Take your grandmother if you must, but if you speak another word of this nonsense in my town, I will have you driven from this valley for good. Do you understand?" Alara looked at the two men, at their starched collars and their unshakable confidence, and she felt a profound and sorrowful pity. They were blind. They stood on the edge of a precipice and argued about the proper placement of a footstool. She said nothing more, simply turned and guided Maeve slowly and carefully up the muddy path toward the thundering sound of the Vale. The storm that broke on the evening of October 14th, 1889, was not a storm. It was a meteorological siege. It was a phenomenon later meteorologists would call an atmospheric river, a concentrated plume of tropical moisture that slammed into the cold mountain air of the Cinder Creek Valley. The rain did not fall. It was driven, a solid horizontal wall of water that hammered the world relentlessly. For 36 straight hours, the deluge was unceasing. The sound on the roof of Alara's cedar cabin was a deafening drumroll, but inside, the structure held firm. The pitch-sealed joints did not leak a single drop. The stone hearth radiated a steady, comforting warmth, and the two women sat in its glow, listening to the symphony of the apocalypse raging outside. The roar of the Vale Falls intensified, changing from its familiar thunder to a cataclysmic, world-ending concussion. The volume of water pouring over the escarpment increased tenfold, transforming the graceful curtain into a solid, opaque torrent of brown water, logs, and debris. It struck the riverbed below with the force of a constant explosion, shaking the very granite on which their shelter was built. Yet her design held. The alcove, set back from the main impact zone, remained a pocket of relative calm. The carefully constructed drainage channels, now running at full capacity, collected the immense volume of water seeping from the saturated rock and channeled it away, keeping the stone foundation of the cabin from being undermined. Alara and Maeve were inside a fortress, looking out through a small, thick glass window Alara had salvaged, watching the end of their world unfold behind a wall of water. In Havenwood, confidence gave way to concern, then concern to fear, and finally fear to outright panic. The Cinder Creek, engorged by dozens of overflowing tributaries, swelled into a monstrous entity. At 3:17 a.m. on October 15th, the townspeople were awakened by a sound like the crack of doom. The northern levee, the one Elder Theron's grandfather had so proudly engineered, did not just fail. It disintegrated. A 10-foot-high wall of water, thick with mud and the wreckage of the upper valley, surged into the town. The force was unimaginable. The first rows of houses were not flooded. They were obliterated, swept from their foundations and turned into so much kindling in the churning torrent. The chaos was absolute. The church bell, its rope pulled by the current, began to toll a frantic, random dirge. The screams of the terrified were swallowed by the roar of the flood. People scrambled for high ground that no longer existed. Rooftops became fleeting islands of refuge. Elder Theron, his wife, Deacon Miller, and Silas the blacksmith found themselves clinging to the steeply pitched roof of the meeting hall, the one building whose deep stone foundations had momentarily withstood the initial surge. From their precarious perch, they watched in horror as the Havenwood they knew was erased from existence. They saw their homes, their businesses, their worldly goods, all the symbols of their security and prosperity, smashed and carried away by the merciless, clay-colored water. Not one of them had lost a family member to a wolf. Not one had burned through their wood supply before the first snow. And not one, in that terrifying moment, would admit they had been wrong. But their faces, illuminated by flashes of lightning, were canvases of stark, humbling terror. The 50-year levees had lasted 50 years in one catastrophic night. As dawn broke on October 15th, the rain finally lessened to a steady drizzle, but the scene it revealed was one of utter devastation. Havenwood was gone, replaced by a wide, turbulent lake of muddy water, dotted with the debris of a shattered community. The Cinder Creek had carved a new, wider channel directly through the center of what was once the town. The peak of the flood had passed, but the water remained dangerously high and the currents were a chaotic swirl of eddies and undertows. On the roof of the meeting hall, the small group of survivors, including Theron, Miller, and Silas, shivered uncontrollably from cold and shock. They were marooned, surrounded by a landscape of churning water, with no hope of rescue. It was then that they saw it, a small, dark shape moving purposefully across the water toward them. At first, they thought it was just another piece of debris, perhaps a log or a section of roof. But as it drew closer, they could make out the form of a person, paddling with steady, efficient strokes. It was a coracle, a small, bowl-shaped boat made of animal hide stretched over a wicker frame. And the person paddling it was Alara Vance. She had constructed the boat weeks earlier, following a design from one of her grandmother's stories, waterproofing the hide with the same pine pitch she had used on her cabin. It was light, maneuverable, and perfectly suited for navigating the treacherous, debris-filled water. She approached the meeting hall with a skill that was breathtaking. She seemed to read the unseen currents, using them to her advantage, darting between a floating barn door and the submerged carcass of a cow. She brought the coracle alongside the roof with a quiet bump. The faces of the men who had scorned and expelled her were a mixture of disbelief, shame, and raw, desperate hope. Her own face was calm, her expression unreadable. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a focused determination. "I can take two at a time," she said, her voice carrying clearly over the gurgle of the water. "The women and children first." Over the next 4 hours, Alara Vance became the savior of Havenwood. She piloted her small, primitive boat back and forth across the floodwaters a dozen times. She rescued the Theron and Miller families from the meeting hall roof. She pulled a half-drowned Silas from the branches of a submerged oak tree where he had been clinging for his life. She found other survivors, families huddled on the small islands that were once the tops of hills, and ferried them, 2 by 2, to the only place of safety left in the entire valley, her shelter behind the veil. The scene inside the alcove was surreal. Nearly 20 survivors, the remnants of Havenwood's leadership and their families, were gathered on the dry stone floor of Alara's home. They were wrapped in her woolen blankets, huddled around the steady warmth of her stone hearth, sipping a hot, bitter tea she had brewed from dried yarrow and mint. The thundering roar of the falls outside was a constant reminder of the destructive power they had underestimated. Yet inside this small, cedar-scented space, they were safe. They looked around at the perfectly joined timbers, the ingeniously vented hearth, the sturdy walls anchored to the mountain itself. They saw not the folly of a mad girl, but a work of profound and practical genius. Elder Theron, his face pale and his clothes soaked, sat on a small wooden stool Alara had made. He looked at her, his eyes stripped of all their former arrogance. He tried to speak, to form the words of apology and gratitude that were warring in his throat, but all he could manage was a choked, broken sound. He stopped, shaking his head. "We were wrong. About everything." Silas, the blacksmith, a man of few words, simply stared at the iron pythons visible in the wall, the ones he had forged, now holding the structure that had saved his life. He nodded his head slowly, a gesture of profound, silent respect. Deacon Miller, whose entire world had been measured in profit and loss, looked at the young woman who had spent a mere $27 on materials to build a sanctuary that was now, by any measure, priceless. He wept quietly into his hands. Vindication for Alara was not a shouted boast or a bitter, "I told you so." It was this, the quiet, complete, and humbling silence of the men who had cast her out. In the days that followed, the waters of the Cinder Creek slowly receded, revealing a landscape of profound and sorrowful ruin. The town of Havenwood was a wasteland of mud, splintered lumber, and shattered lives. Of the 78 souls who had called the town home, 31 had been lost to the flood. The survivors were refugees in their own valley, their community erased, their confidence in their own judgment utterly broken. They had nowhere to go and no one to lead them. All eyes turned to the one person who had foreseen the disaster, the one person whose home had been untouched, the one person who had possessed the skill and courage to save them. Alara Vance, the 19-year-old outcast, became their de facto leader. Her small cabin behind the waterfall became the command center for the rebuilding effort. The condescension and scorn she had endured were replaced by a deep and reverent respect. Her words, once dismissed as the superstitious ramblings of a girl, were now treated as gospel. She organized the survivors into work parties, directing them to salvage what they could from the wreckage and to begin the grim task of burying their dead. Her demeanor never changed. She remained stoic, practical, and methodical. Her authority did not come from a title or a vote, but from the unassailable evidence of her competence. The narrative of her achievement became a didactic lesson for the entire valley. The omniscient voice of history could now clearly articulate the moral of the story. The council's folly was not merely a misjudgment of weather, it was a catastrophic failure of imagination. Their worldview, rigid and patriarchal, was built on the assumption that their methods were inherently superior and that any deviation was folly. They had built their town with straight lines and right angles, imposing their will upon the landscape, while Alara had built her shelter in harmony with it. She had listened to the mountain, observed the water, and respected its power. Her knowledge, passed down from her grandmother, was not primitive superstition, but a deeply empirical science, refined over generations of observation. The men of Havenwood had trusted in levees, in their own strength and reason, and had been destroyed. Alara had trusted in drainage, in the resilience of cedar and the strength of the mountain itself, and she had endured. Weeks after the flood, as the first snows of winter began to dust the high peaks, Alara stood with Elder Theron on a bluff overlooking the ruined valley. Theron was a changed man, his face etched with grief and humility. "We plan to rebuild," he said, his voice quiet, "but we do not know where or how." He was not telling her, he was asking her. Alara looked down at the scar the flood had carved through the land. Then she looked up, toward the higher ground, toward the rolling hills and protected meadows well above the creek's new floodplain. "You will not rebuild here," she stated, her voice calm but resolute. "This is the water's land now. You will build on higher ground, away from the creek. You will build smaller houses with deep stone foundations. You will orient them to the sun for warmth, and you will not clear-cut the trees on the slopes above you, for their roots are what hold the earth in place." She was not just giving advice. She was issuing a new set of laws, laws dictated not by a town council, but by the immutable principles of nature. Her vindication was absolute, but it was a somber triumph. It had come at the cost of 31 lives and the destruction of a way of life. The story of Alara Vance and the flood of 1889 would become a local legend, a cautionary tale about the perils of arrogance and the wisdom of listening to the quiet voices of the past. She had been cast out as a burden and had returned as a savior. She had sought only to survive and had, in the process, inherited the heavy mantle of leadership. Her journey from outcast to sage was complete, not marked by a celebration, but by the quiet, monumental task of teaching a broken people how to live in their valley once more, this time with the respect and humility that the water had so brutally taught them.